Good evening. Well, the motion says that human nature is better understood through science than through philosophy and artistic reflection. But it also, in the discussion around it, we're also thinking about whether or not there's still a role for artistic and philosophical reflection, given that we have science. And I think there is, but I think it must, to some extent, play second fiddle to science. And so I shall say a little bit about why I think that is. I want to start by saying that when people seek to put limits on the scientific understanding of human nature, they often seem to be concerned with the cutting edge of contemporary science, whilst taking for granted the knowledge we have of our nature from past science. How many of us would really do without the knowledge that the heart pumps the blood, that we think with our brains, that we're evolved beings, that human reproduction involves the fertilization by a sperm of an egg, that there are conditions such as dementia, dyslexia, autism, all of which we only understand because of science, and which, were we not to live in a culture which had scientific understanding, we would be interpreting in terms of what? Well, of demonic possession, of spirits, or whatever else. So I take it that it's part of what we take for granted that we understand our nature as natural beings through science. And the track record of philosophers and artists and anyone else in correctly intuiting our nature is bad. That we find out about our nature through experiment and through testing theories, rather than just by sitting back and thinking about what we're like. When we sit back and think about what we like, what we tend to get is the prejudices that our culture gives us. Now, that doesn't follow from that we should believe all and everything that people called scientists tell us about ourselves. And so I think we should have a differentiated attitude to the products of scientific inquiry. Tried and tested, established science about fundamentals is to be trusted. Speculative, new hypotheses are to be treated with skepticism. So to embrace and accept the motion is not to believe that everything that people hyping up their work in evolutionary psychology or or neuroscience says. The next thing I would say is that there's something of a false dichotomy posed by the question, which asks whether there's a place for artistic and philosophical reflection given science, without considering the fact that artistic and philosophical reflection is often informed by science, and that one could see that as a really important role for art and philosophy, to articulate what science has told us about ourselves and its consequences for people to understand in a way that they wouldn't necessarily get by reading scientific journals. And I think we see this played out all the time when artists and novelists and philosophers write and create works of art that would be impossible to imagine without science. That is, they take science as their subject matter, represent it in art and philosophy, and then think about it. Now, there are aspects of our natures which are very difficult for science to investigate. And most famously, perhaps, these include consciousness, the first-person perspective. Whilst I think that we should be very wary of ideas about those being eliminable or illusory, or that science has already told us enough about them, it's also true that the track record of people setting limits for scientific inquiry into human beings is not a good one. In the late 19th century, to be scientistic was to believe that science could tell us about human nature and society. And I think it's clear that that battle was lost by the anti-scientistic people. We have learned a great deal about human nature and society from science, and we shouldn't set limits as to what we will learn in the future. Now, of course, the motion talks about understanding, and that's really ambiguous between collective understanding and individual understanding. And it may well be true that the best way for an individual to come to know about human nature is not, as I was suggesting before, to read a scientific journal, but to read an artist, a philosopher, or a humanist who's communicating it for them. Indeed, one might think, if you really want to understand dementia, or dyslexia, or autism, then what you should do is read a novel about those things. Because individual human beings learn very well from narrative, from stories in which there are human actors with whom they can identify, and so on. My point is not that art and literature can't communicate. Sometimes they can communicate better, and sometimes they may give us the best kind of understanding that we can have, but that will be an understanding of knowledge that they themselves can't provide. Art and literature don't tell us that about the nature of ourselves as human beings. They reflect the knowledge that we otherwise have. Now, I think it's also worth pointing out that there's much in contemporary science which may not deliver understanding at all. So increasingly people are using expert systems and big data and the analysis of statistics to make predictions about human beings. And we might fear that that will produce a kind of predictive empirical science without delivering any understanding. So it's no part of my view that science necessarily gives us understanding or the right kind of understanding, and it may be that there are some areas of science that we should take seriously and others that we should complain about for their lack of an attempt to properly engage with issues of nature and cause and what kind of beings we are, as opposed to just the attempt to predict and control us. Of course, people are controllable, and one of the things that controls us is the ideas that we ourselves generate about ourselves. And one might object to a premise of the motion, or see an implicit premise in the motion that there is such a thing as human nature, that it's fixed, that it doesn't change. And I would like to disassociate myself as a defender of the motion from that claim. Human nature changes as we learn to think differently about ourselves through scientific knowledge. Now, science can't tell us what to value either. And so if we regard what's really important about human nature as what we value or should value, or if what we think is really important about human nature is our moral being, then I would say that science tells us nothing directly about that. However, I would also suggest that if we want to make the world a better place and instantiate our values, doing so in a way that's informed by scientific knowledge of what people are actually like, how to get them to behave one way rather than another, would be a good idea. That is, we need science even to make more practical our ethical and moral goals. It's very important, though, that we can't derive ethics and morality from science. The attempt to replace ideas of the good with ideas of fitness is fallacious. And to that extent, I will distance myself from the motion in part. So if the motion is interpreted as saying something like, we can expect science to replace morality or ethics, then, well, I don't subscribe to that. Indeed, science is a normative activity. Scientific deliberation relies on ideas of reason and justification and truth, and our valuing those things. and arguably science itself can't give us those ideas or tell us that we should value them. So the final point I would make then is just that, yes, we can understand ourselves through art and the humanities and philosophy, but we do so best when we take our scientific knowledge of the world as the resources that we use for our reflection. And so to that extent, it's true that science gives us our best understanding of human nature.
Well, I have to say I'm feeling a bit sorry for our motion because James was so balanced and so even-handed that poor old motion seems to have no friends at this stage. However, I'll assume that it needs still to be opposed. But first of all, some clarification. I'm assuming for the purpose of our discussion that science is meant to designate objective, quantitative natural science. Secondly, I'm not going to argue that the sciences can tell us nothing about ourselves. James is absolutely right in that respect. And this will be particularly odd for someone like me, who was a doctor and a neuroscientist for many decades. No, the question is whether the sciences would render the arts and philosophy redundant. A huge question, and my 10 minutes plus injury time gives me time only to examine the general idea and to glance at a worked example. Now, first, the general idea. I think what we're concerned about is scientism, which might be characterized with the help of a couple of quotations. The first one is from the physicist Steven Weinberg, who espouses an industrial strength scientism. He asserts that all the explanatory arrows point downwards from societies to people, to organs to cells, to biochemistry to chemistry, and ultimately to physics. Societies are explained by people, people by organs, organs by cells, cells by biochemistry, biochemistry by chemistry, and chemistry by physics. And for explanation, read understanding. A less extreme form of scientism, and probably one more relevant to our discussion tonight, is from E.O. Wilson. He is the prophet of consilience, the linking together of principles and methods from different disciplines in pursuit of an overarching inquiry. What does Wilson say? The humanities, ranging from philosophy and history to moral reasoning, comparative religion, and interpretation of the arts, will draw closer to the sciences and partly fuse with them. Now, this is not as even-handed as it sounds, because the fusion that Wilson envisages is one that takes place not in some neutral territory, but in the homeland of science. An example he gives is neurobiologically based aesthetics, which I hope we may discuss perhaps because we'll have some fun. But this is what I believe we're talking about. So why do I think sciences, even apparently relevant ones such as the neurosciences, are unfitted to take over the role of philosophy and artistic reflection in helping us to understand ourselves? Well, the banal answer, no less true for being a truism, is that natural science has flourished by marginalizing something central to our humanity. It is essentially objective and quantitative and general, and it focuses on law-governed mechanisms. By contrast, our humanity is defined by subjective experience, steeped in qualities, and agency is absolutely central. The focus in science is, of course, on measurement and getting the human subject, with his or her prejudices, his or her parochial viewpoints and values, out of the way. Galileo famously said that the book of nature was written in the language of mathematics. Quantities, size, shape, number are primary, and those experiences that colour them in, such as colour, smell and taste, are merely secondary. As for meanings and values, pains and pleasures, they are yet more marginal, mere tertiary qualities. And the consequences of this are huge. As the historian of science, E.A. Burt, pointed out, in the course of translating this distinction of primary and secondary into terms suited to the new mathematical interpretation of nature, we have the first stage in the reading out of man quite out, and the reading of man quite out of the real and primary realm. As natural science becomes more fundamental and its laws more general, so subjective experience and qualities and even everyday material objects are squeezed out of its account of the world. And this is something I think James has conceded. Now, very few, though there are some, would suggest that physics will cast light on human nature, or that there could be a quantum mechanics of laughter. but many place great hope in the neurosciences. The latter, however, have won their spurs as real sciences by modelling themselves on the older ones, being objective, quantitative, and generalising, and measurement remains central. Even though the putative concern of scientific psychology may be the person, neuroscience cannot fully accommodate the first person singular, I, the first person plural, we, and the second person, thou and you, modes of being which are inseparable from our humanity and are central to the art that reflects on it. And in fact, James has mentioned this. While art is about human life seen from within, understood rather than merely quantified from without, natural science is determinately non-anthropocentric. The human subject is squeezed to the margins. Even so, some still imagine that the royal road to advancing our understanding of the human subject lies through using advances in neuroscience, particularly those that permit observation of activity in the waking brain, using scanners and the like. They are, I believe, deluded. The yawning gap between what they study, for example, brain events, and our humanity remains and will remain wide. This gap is evident even at a very basic level. Brain science cannot grasp, nor does it have the conceptual framework to grasp, the unity and multiplicity of the conscious moment, and the connectedness over time that is gathered up in the notion of selfhood. It's highly pertinent that, as we know from physics, a material object such as a brain cannot house tensed time, which lies at the heart of the temporal depth of human consciousness, of explicit memory and explicit sense of the future. And agency, central to our humanity, which is profoundly dependent on tensed time, likewise eludes neuroscience, as a distinguished neuroscientist has pointed out. The human brain, he says, is a machine which alone accounts for all our actions, our most private thoughts, so he believes, and our beliefs. It makes no sense in scientific terms to try to distinguish sharply between acts that result from conscious attention and those that result from our reflexes or are caused by disease or damage to the brain. And as for the higher level stuff, such as love, hatred, joy, happiness and unhappiness, the home territory of art, they lie beyond the reach of brain science. But this is not for the want of trying. So-called social neuroscience believes that it has the tools to x-ray the human soul and cast light on, for example, our sense of beauty, the nature of wisdom and romantic love. Well, let me illustrate how well this works with one example which will have to stand for many thousands. A scientist whose name I shall withhold for the sake of his colleagues, but he published, for the sake of his family, but he published in a very well-respected journal, invited a group of subjects to insert their heads into an fMRI scanner, and he recorded the responses of their brains when they were showed pictures of people who were mere acquaintances, and then the responses of the brains when they were shown pictures of people they were deeply in love with. The distinctive brain responses associated with the photographs of the loved one are shown on the slide. Does that really tell us anything about love? Even if love did boil down to a succession of responses to stimuli, which, for the Martians in the audience, it doesn't. Would it render this scanner, these eyes, this mind, this heart, the Proust scanner, and indeed this image, à la recherche de temps perdu, would it render them redundant? I think the answer is obvious. But the example simply highlights the absurdity of imagining that objective quantitative science can advance so far that it takes us beyond the narrated testimony of individuals, takes us beyond music and visual art in furthering our understanding of humanity. Brain scans, by the way, bypass history, culture, and the community of minds, but I'm flogging a horse, which I hope by now is already dead. Some of the aficionados of neuroscientism have discovered that the fundamentals of our humanity, such as selfhood and agency, and even distinctively human complex emotions, such as love, cannot be adequately understood by neuroscience. But they argue on this basis that they aren't real. But this is like a deaf man saying there are no such things as sounds, because he can't hear them. Of course, neuroscience has some very general things to say about some aspects of our life. Injuries to the brain lead to deficits in functions, such as speech, which may be highly relevant to living. But this only demonstrates that a working brain is a necessary condition for human consciousness, for agency, for temporal depth, and so on. but not a sufficient condition. Brain activity is the beginning and not the end of the story leading up to human nature. So much for neuroscientism. There is, however, no reason, once you've started on the reductionist journey described by Steven Weinberg in my earlier slide, there's no reason for stopping at any point between societies and physics. And of course, the final destination of this explanatory journey is a picture of the world as a set of mathematical relations. And as James will, I'm sure, certainly agree, material objects usually dissolve under such circumstances. But most importantly for our debate, humanity is effaced. The more powerful the science, the more human face will be erased from its mirror. Reductionism, by the way, encounters one very large problem. If X's, such as people, boil down to Y's, such as nerve impulses, how can Y's boil up to X's? And the usual response to this challenge is to resort to some hand-waving term, like emergence, a kind of alchemical explanation. It's a bit like saying magic, or like the comedian Tommy Cooper would say, just like that. Finally, a quick and final word about philosophy. If, as Wilfrid Sellars said, the aim of philosophy is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term, and under things, he says, we include such objects or such items as cabbages and kings, numbers and duties, possibilities and finger snaps, aesthetic experience and death, philosophy should not be content with taking its orders from science. For a start, it will miss out on what I believe to be its most important task, trying to understand the relationship between anti-anthropocentric science and necessarily anthropocentric art and humanities, and indeed anthropic everyday life. Trying to look at the relationship between what Sellars called the scientific and the manifest or everyday images of the world. So these are some of my reasons for opposing the proposition that human nature is best understood through natural science rather than through philosophical and artistic reflection. I've got others. For example, art and philosophy go beyond science in making visible what has to be understood about humanity and the world in all its mystery, complexity, horror, glory, quiet joys and quiet sorrows. But my essential point is that irrespective of whether the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics and science, the book of us most certainly isn't. Thank you.
Would you like to come in first, Jim, and challenge some of the things or pick up some of the points made?
Yes. The first point I'd make is that the motion doesn't say anything about reductionism and doesn't say that we can know about ourselves through physics. The motion's about whether we know about ourselves through science or through artistic and philosophical reflection. And the challenge I want to make to Ray is to give an example of knowledge of human nature that comes from art and philosophical reflection rather than through science, because I take it that pretty much everything about my self-understanding comes from scientific knowledge. I mean, that's because I mean, me in particular, because I'm a product of a secular education in, the late 20th century of Western Europe. But what I mean about my self-understanding is that I'm a natural being, that I exist inside the causal nexus of physical events in space-time, that my emotions, my thoughts, my perceptions are one way or another products of my biological being and my interaction with the world. And that I know various things about that are important about human beings, like, for example, where babies come from, and that when someone starts to lose their mind when they get old, it isn't because they're possessed by evil spirits, and that people with dyslexia aren't just stupid. Now, all of those things that we know about ourselves come because of systematic inquiry by science, not by someone sitting doing first-person reflection, which would tell us none of it. And indeed, people have said all sorts of ridiculous things based on their philosophical reflection. Aristotle and how many teeth women have, for being a classic example, right? So you sit back and think about yourself as much as you like. What you find out that's true by way of knowledge of your nature will be what you've learned from science. Anything else, well, it won't be knowledge of your nature. You can't know what kind of being you are just by thinking about it. Now, can I talk for a minute longer? I also think that it's a complete mistake to think that because there is such a thing as a first-person perspective, we should regard it as somehow other and separate from what we know about ourselves from the third-person perspective. So whilst I have to, maybe as Kant would say, act under the idea of freedom and think of myself under the idea of freedom when I reason, it's also true that I can learn things about myself from a third-person perspective and bring those to bear when I think about my reasoning. So I might, for example, find out about implicit bias or stereotype, and then ask myself whether the things I believe for epistemically good reasons, or whether in fact some of the things I believe for bad reasons, for reasons not at all, but I'm caused to believe them by my culture or by my prejudices. So keeping the first-person perspective separate from the third-person perspective, I think, is a mistake. I might even go so far as to say it's dangerous. The first-person perspective doesn't have any kind of autonomy, and I would reiterate, I think, it doesn't deliver knowledge of our nature. If by knowledge of our nature you mean the kinds of things that to which I've referred.
Thank you. Do you want to take up that now?
Yes, well, thank you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I mean, first of all, I haven't got a hidden agenda. Well, at least, I suppose I have an unhidden agenda. I'm a secular humanist, so I suspect that James and I share that view. And of course, I'm not against science. My God, science has utterly, totally transformed our life. What James has said in relation, for example, to Aristotle and subsequent science and our knowledge about where babies come from and so on, it's about bad science versus better science. And of course, I believe that we need empirical investigation to find out where babies come from, and indeed how they develop and how they flourish and so on and so forth. Am I about reduction? Well, motion may not be about reductionism, but out there are an awful lot of people who do feel we can be reduced at least as far as nerve impulses. That many people feel it's very promising, that there's a lot of promise in neuroscience, and that will enable us to understand ourselves. And I've given reasons why I don't think that's the case. James asked, have I learned anything from art that I haven't, that I couldn't, as it were, learn from science? And perhaps, yes, a lot of things have been made visible to me through art, which would otherwise not be visible. So when you're reading War and Peace, of course, you don't get, as it were, a biopsy of the human brain or whatever. You learn something quite different. And I think that's very, very, very important. It's a question of making the world visible. Very interesting, James made a point about existing in the causal nexus in space and time. And that's something where we profoundly disagree. Of course, we use causes and we have to respect the laws of nature. The very fact that our actions deliver the things we want depend on the reliability of causal relations and the laws of nature. But the fact that we use causes and we can see causes and we can see the cause of nature indicates that we are not completely soluble fish in a world of physical causation. And that's something quite important. And that's related to the final point he made, which was as it were, the independence of the first-person viewpoint. Actually, the science viewpoint isn't third person. It's actually no person. F equals ma isn't he, it's no person. And I think that's very important to realize that. So that comes back to my point, which is, of course, objective science is fantastically effective, and thank you, science, precisely because it eradicates the person. And it looks at, it aspires to what Thomas Nagel called a view from nowhere, which means a view from no one. Lots of other points I'd like to make, but they're my initial ones.
Yeah. there anything very briefly you'd like to come back on before we move on?
Well, just very quickly to say, I completely disagree that science abolishes the person. I think if you look at the advances that we've made in understanding the kinds of conditions I talked about, I mentioned for good reason, dementia, for example. I mean, that's about studying people and what happens to them. And it's important for understanding, for treatment, for living well, that we understand conditions like that. And we only understand them because of scientific inquiry. We don't understand them just by armchair reflection. So I think it's a mistake to think that science abolishes the person. It needn't at all. There's scientific inquiry in the social sciences very much concerned with people. And I also think that to move from a picture doesn't show me about love, it's not the same thing as love. You know, brain activity is not the same thing as love. Doesn't mean that we don't understand our emotions and motivations through neuroscience, and that we might potentially understand them much better through future neuroscience. As I said, I think the track record of setting limits to what we can understand about ourselves through science is not a good one, even if, as always, you know, the claims about what we're about to understand or already understand are often hyped and exaggerated by people who have an interest in promoting their own work.
I mean, for me, the example of neurological disease is a particularly poignant one, because all my research is in the area of neurological disease. I didn't research in dementia, but I researched in stroke and so on and so forth, epilepsy, etc. And of course, we understand the causation of these things, but the experience of being somebody who has dementia, the phenomenology of dementia at the most intimate level, that is something that isn't captured by amyloid protein precursors and all of those things that we look to in order to look for ways of treating dementia. So there's some quite separate things, and that's why I think an amyloid protein precursor, for example, is simply no person. It's not a third person, it's no person. But of course, those no personal approaches may well deliver the kind of treatments we very much hope for people with dementia.
But don't you think it may develop so that you will understand more? We're at the beginning of what you're doing, and you're in the area of neuroscience the area of neuroscience is comparatively at its beginnings and has made enormous progress, but given another 150 years, might you not understand as much as you think that Proust understood in a different way.
This is the argument from the promissory note. It does seem to me that, obviously, there is no limit, it seems to me, to what neuroscience might achieve in understanding brain function and dysfunction. The extent to which that will deliver further understanding of what it's like to be in love or what it's like to suffer dementia, I think it's highly unlikely. That's a different area. So in words...
Is it a different area? Because to take the quotation you used at the very top of your talk, if it does go down from outside right to the cell, I'm not talking about units rather than different areas.
I'm not too sure. I mean, in many ways, I took Steven Weinberg as my sort of drunken helot, the example of what happens when you take reductionism right down and you end up with trying to interpret societies through atoms. And there's no limit, in a sense, once you start reducing, where you should stop. And by the way, I don't have a dualist agenda even. I'm secular humanist, not even a dualist. I'm an ontological agnostic.
Well, my connections are all against Steven Weinberg, and I would say, well, how can Jane Austen, a scientific thought probably never crossed her mind, and yet she produces novels which tell us a great deal about human personality, human behaviour, human reaction, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, it seems to me that in this great scientific inquiry, which is just really, and that sort of literature has been underway, as you know, for one way or another for over 2,000 years. This great scientific inquiry is begun, but only just begun. It may be, it's a possibility, I don't know, but it is a possibility that we may find out from fundamentals, things that we now found out from extraordinarily intelligent generalizations, which are convincing because we share the society in which those generalizations come from and which they're made. I don't think it's just a promissory note. I think maybe you consider it as a possibility.
Well, all things are possible so long one entertains them. I leave that hanging in the air. Yeah.
It's now time to summarise. As you started, can you do the first summary and then listen and then write?
Yes, scientism is a word that's used pejoratively, but when it was originally introduced, it meant people who thought we could learn about human nature and society through science. And my claim is that we all ought to think that we can learn about human nature and society through science. And then the question is, can we learn best about human nature and society through science? And I think the answer to that question is yes, we can, because science will deliver us reliable knowledge where art and philosophy, left to their own devices, will reflect prejudice and culture and common sense and our everyday experience rather than giving us knowledge. So I defend the motion. However, the motion doesn't say that we don't learn anything at all through art and philosophy. It doesn't say there isn't a role for art and philosophy. And it doesn't say that individuals may best learn about things that we collectively know scientifically through art. And so I make the point again that it may well be true that whilst we collectively learn about a condition like dementia through science, it may be that as an individual I'm going to learn best about dementia by watching a film or reading a novel. So I would urge people not to read things into the motion that aren't there. It doesn't say anything about reductionism, doesn't say that science has already told us about the nature of consciousness. Indeed, it may be that that there's some residue that science will never be able to tell us about. I don't know, maybe science will never tell us about consciousness, maybe it's beyond our comprehension. But we should be very wary of believing the representations we get about the will and consciousness and the self in literature and in art and in philosophy, because often they're based on nothing more than prejudice and wishful thinking.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean oh yes, thank you. Yes, I mean the exam question is human nature is better understood through science than through philosophical and artistic reflection. And I read this as welcoming these new disciplines such as neuroaesthetics, neurolaw, neuroeconomics, evolutionary ethics, and so on and so forth, as basically bringing a new wave of understanding to humanity which simply was not accessible before then. And I think they, as a matter of fact, they've contributed nothing. Of course, science, thank you, has increased our life expectancy, health expectancy, comfort expectancy, fun expectancy, and so on and so forth. All of those things have come from science. And as somebody who's worked in science for all my life, I'm not unaware of that, nor unaware of the difficulty of science, but I'm also aware of the methodology of science. And the most important thing about science is it is quantitative, it is generalizing, and it is inescapably reductive. When you go into the laboratory, you reduce the situation to a much more less complex one than the messy, unbounded complexity of everyday life. And that relates, which is my final point, to the gentleman who mentioned the android. One of the big problems of getting androids to work around the world is that there are hundreds of thousands of implicit frames and laws that regulate our normal behavior. None of those can be incorporated into scientific experiments. So humanity inevitably has to be shrunk when it enters the laboratory, for good reasons that may produce humane results. But the fact remains, humanity itself is not better understood through being brought into the laboratory. So thank you.